Professor Falk, you have a great deal of experience in the Mideast, in particular, having been Special Rapporteur on Palestinian territories, if that was your exact title. Correct me if I'm wrong. Could you tell us what you see going on in Israel today, particularly, I mean, the assault on Gaza, but also the West Bank, as you've written about extensively?
Well, it's difficult always to interpret what Israel is doing, because they quite frequently say one thing and do something quite different. In my judgment, the horrifying attack in Gaza is only partially and maybe only marginally motivated by the effort to destroy Hamas as a political actor. I think that it has as its primary objectives the option of resettling northern Gaza and claiming the oil and gas deposits off the Gaza coast, which are apparently very valuable. Estimates of $500 billion have been made by relevant experts. And then the precious prize that hasn't yet been captured by the Zionist project is sovereign control over the West Bank, which still has the status of being an occupied territory. And one notices that the upsurge in violence in Gaza, which is vindicated by those that support Israel as a justifiable exercise of self-defense after the October 7th Hamas attack. But its political function can more plausibly be understood, I think, by giving the settler violence a brighter green light to intimidate and, if to the extent necessary, dispossess enough of the population of the West Bank so that what amounts to a second Nakba, or Palestinian catastrophe, occurs, and a situation exists where not only de facto control of the West Bank is maintained, but some sort of sovereign incorporation which would complete the Greater Israel image that motivates maximal Zionism, which is to recover complete control of the so-called promised land of biblical construction that has always been in the background of the Zionist movement. One remembers the first Israeli president, a very strong secularist, David Ben-Gurion, used to hold up the Bible and say, "This will be our weapon." And by that, I think he meant that the biblical entitlement will provide a sufficient motivation politically and militarily that eventually Israel can claim sovereign control over the entire territorial expanse between the river and the sea. And that's become much more and more explicit with the passage of time. In 2018, Israel's basic law adopted a provision which suggested or which asserted that Israel was a Jewish supremacy state in which only the Jewish people had a right of self-determination, and in which the settler communities would be conceived of as part of what Israel claims to be under this umbrella of Jewish supremacy.
You say that was in 2018. The president at the time was Donald Trump. How much do you think that Donald Trump gave a green light to Netanyahu to take these most extreme measures?
My impression is that it was the greenest light that was ever shown in the Israeli direction. And that's against the continuity of green lights that earlier presidents had shown, but with some qualifications and some hesitation. So what distinguishes Trump, and to some degree has been adhered to by Biden, is a rather unconditional mandate to complete the Zionist project as it is conceived by the maximalist views of what constitutes fulfillment of its vision and mission. And I think when this coalition government that took power in January of 2023 and brought into high levels of governance the so-called religious Zionist Party, which was generally perceived as the most extreme and racist leadership that Israel ever had in its history. This was the culmination of the Trump approach, that you give Israel and the Zionist movement everything at once, but you do it by stages. And we now are experiencing what, from the point of view of the maximal Zionist, is the end game of the promise of achieving full control over the promised land. Now, whether that is truly the end game or is really another stage in an expansionist vision which may view territorial encroachment on Israel's neighbors, Lebanon and Jordan in particular, as the next candidate for Israel to claim a sufficient security justification to grab some of their territory.
The maximalist wing of the Israeli, as you call it, Zionist project would have included Menachem Begin, I believe, whom Einstein and Hannah Arendt had both taken out a full-page ad with other Jewish Americans denouncing Begin as a fascist when he came to the U.S. for the first time. He took office then, I believe, as prime minister in, I think, 1977, along with the Netanyahus who had always been part of that maximalist wing. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that if you've looked into that history at all?
Yes, I had the occasion to meet Begin when I was in Israel in 1973, I believe, shortly after the 1973 war. And he certainly came across as someone that wasn't prepared to reach a political compromise with the Palestinians. He also was what in the West is often called the political realist, in saying there was no reason the Palestinians should accept this maximalist Zionist vision, and that the only way to secure it was to defeat it. In other words, there was no prospect of acquiescence. There was only a prospect of win or lose. And I think the Netanyahu sequel also has that mentality. Either we win or we lose. Either they lose or they win. In other words, and there's something to that in terms of the way liberation wars end and are historically understood. Kissinger used to say that in a guerrilla war or an counterinsurgency war, if the counterinsurgency side doesn't win, it loses. And it's that win-lose mentality that was operative for the U.S. until it lost in Vietnam, which was an interesting antecedent to what is happening today in Gaza and in the West Bank and Israel.
You're considered, rightfully so, an expert on insurgencies and guerrilla war and the application of international law to them. What you're seeing today in Gaza and with the West Bank and the settler movement taking so much land from displacing the Palestinians, how does that fit into international law?
Well, it completely defies international law, and Israel, from the moment of its founding, and arguably its founding itself, were a repudiation of international law as widely understood. There were international lawyers who were Zionists and who interpreted international law in such a way as to validate Israeli claims. And one of the characteristics of any legal order is that contradictory interpretations can be made. The legal profession depends on the ambiguity of law, otherwise there'd be no reason for opposing sides to ever hire a lawyer. It's not generally understood that law by its nature is somewhat ambiguous and depends on interpretation. And judges and courts are often divided in their understanding of law. But in this context of really dispossessing a people from their own territory, from their own homeland, one is confronting a fairly clear imperative of contemporary international law, which invalidates colonial ambitions and colonial projects, of which Zionism is the most important post-World War II such endeavor. And therefore, from the outset, it has been in direct conflict with fundamentally agreed upon norms of law, especially those incorporated in the Fourth Geneva Convention on Belligerent Occupation, which became very important after the 1967 war, when Israel for the first time occupied the West Bank and East Jerusalem and reoccupied Gaza. The notion of occupation is different, fundamentally different in relation to international law than is the relationship between two sovereign states, or even between a sovereign state and a non-state entity of some kind. There is no such thing as self-defense in the context of occupation, because the primary legal duty of the occupying power is to render protection and provide for the security of the occupied people. And Israel, from the outset, has engaged in multiple forms of collective punishment, which is a flagrant and continuing violation of Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And in the present context, the decree of General Gallant that cut off food and medical supplies, as well as electricity and water and food from the West Bank, is in direct, explicit violation of Article 55 of the Geneva Convention, which imposes a duty on the occupying power, an unconditional duty, to ensure that the population has adequate food and medical supplies and attention. In other words, the responsibility for maintaining a food supply market plus health facilities are being so blatantly repudiated in this Gaza military operation of Israel as to defy the most primitive notion of adherence to international law. And therefore it puts the Western countries, especially the US, but also Germany, France, and the UK, in an extremely awkward position for two reasons. One is it exhibits hypocritical double standards because of its recent insistence on compliance with international law when it came to Russia's behavior in the Ukraine context. And secondly, because these are the governments that have lectured the world on the importance of the rule of law and of adhering to standards of human rights and behaving in a way that respects the dignity of individuals and societies. That was part of what the post-Cold War ethos was supposed to impart to the world, this image of what a flourishing democracy provides people with, as distinct from what an autocracy that imposes its will on the population under its control does by way of governance. And Biden in particular tried to suggest that the post-Cold War world was one polarized between democracies and autocracies, not being sufficiently embarrassed by the fact that a lot of the countries that were allied with the US and part of the so-called alliance of democracies were anything but democratic states. India and Israel itself are flagrant examples, but there are several others that are equally inconsistent with the practice of democratic values.
I believe you knew Sheldon Wolin of Princeton, a political theorist.
Yes, we were colleagues.
He wrote a book, or a couple different books, but he wrote an article for The Nation in about 2003 in which he called the United States an inverted totalitarianism, meaning we had the facade of democracy, but underneath we had become a light form, call it, of totalitarianism, with our wars around the world just beginning, or really not just beginning, but continuing, but accelerating. You see any application? And let me say, as a Guantanamo defense attorney, I had to extensively study occupation law, but also martial law and regimes that had martial law in the past. Ernst Frankl, a Jewish-German political theorist and lawyer, had written in his book, the first line in it, that martial law was the legal system of Nazi Germany. With a similarity between occupation law and martial law, it really has opened up how identical, I would say, to how Israel is providing as occupation law, but is really a form of martial law in the harshest possible way. Sorry to go on so long, but any comments on that?
Yeah, yes, I think, though, it's important to emphasize the distinction between the two kinds of law, because the martial law is generated by the occupying power, and it's a unilaterally generated legal order that has no accountability to international standards, whereas the occupation framework that is embedded in the Geneva Convention is one that obligates an occupying power to act toward the occupied people in a specified way that upholds their basic civil rights and political rights and ensures their safety in situations of economic or political crisis. So, and the accountability procedures that the UN has generated, the special rapporteurs of which I was one, and the current one, Francesca Albanese, has consistently expressed in her report the severity of Israel's violations of its obligations under the Geneva Conventions, and that preceded the October 7th provocation of this genocidal Israeli response, so that one has a contradiction between what the U.S. has empowered itself to do in Guantanamo and in Iraq, other counterinsurgency settings, and what international humanitarian law imposes on states as their obligation in the event that they do occupy foreign countries or foreign societies.
So is Israel violating that international law of occupation, as you've discussed?
Oh, yes, it's violating it fundamentally by not even cooperating with the UN in its fact-finding initiatives. For instance, after the military attack on Gaza in 2008-2009, a fact-finding commission was appointed by the Human Rights Council and headed by Judge Goldstone from South Africa, South African jurist, who presided over this commission, and it reached very devastating findings about the violation of international laws of war during that military attack, and made policy recommendations that were never carried out, but indicated the legal responsibilities of Israel and its failure to uphold those responsibilities. Goldstone himself, in a kind of dramatic turn, who was a Zionist sympathizer, or maybe even a Zionist, somewhat retracted the main conclusions of the report after he was viciously attacked by the leadership in Israel and called an anti-Semite who had issued a blood libel against the Jewish people, the same kind of accusation that has been made recently with respect to the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, when he said that the October 7th Hamas attack, although it included some serious war crimes, did not occur in a vacuum, by which he meant that Israel's behavior provoked resistance, which the Palestinians were entitled to exercise, that there is a right of resistance, although it must be carried out in accordance with international legal limits. So that imperative is not very often respected, and the Allied powers during World War II did not complain that the resistance forces in France and elsewhere in Europe didn't comply with international law. So there's always some tendency to instrumentalize international law and make it a policy tool for those that are engaged in behavior that either implements the law or violates the law. Law can be useful in either direction and is used both by imperial forces to protect their economic rights and by resistance forces to object to interference with their territorial sovereignty. So it's a complicated subject matter that doesn't lend itself to simplistic generalization.
You mentioned what happened at Goldstone, and I've read Israeli publications on cognitive warfare operations. There's a book entitled Hearts and Minds that came out a few years ago, subtitled Israel and the Battle for Public Opinion. in which the author puts information warfare, psychological operations, all those sorts of things that they've been perception management, as they've been called, and now cognitive warfare into the realm of low intensity conflict, in his view, calling for the as necessity of it to be waged against anyone who says anything critical of Israel. How much of that is going on today? How much was it going on against Goldstone and you in the past, would you say? And how the state of Israel, Jewish state of Israel, the IDF, are manipulating public opinion with these, what has become much more sophisticated techniques?
That's a very important dimension of Israel's foreign and, for that matter, domestic policy. And I think part of the sophistication of that, what I call discourse control, is a learning experience from South Africa's failure to do so, and to find itself in the condition of being a pariah state, which under international pressures was forced eventually to abandon apartheid. And many people look to that South African antecedent as relevant to the situation of the Palestinians in Israel. So there's a Hebrew word, hasbara, that is often used to suggest the importance that is accorded to this kind of information war that Israeli think tanks and Zionist groups throughout the world practice with irresponsible but effective skill. They think nothing of defaming people in ways they know are false. For instance, the weaponization of anti-Semitism is mainly directed not at people who genuinely hate Jews or are anti-Semites, but they're directed at people that are critical of Israel for violating human rights or international law and the justice of a fair outcome to the struggle with Palestine. And the objective is not to prevent anti-Semitism. In fact, it gives some encouragement to anti-Semites because it's so unfairly applied to people who are anything but. And what its purpose is to deflect the conversation from the message to the messenger. In other words, it's much better to have a conversation from Israel's point of view. It's much better to have a conversation about whether I'm an anti-Semite than it is to talk about the substantive allegations of the reports that I was making to the UN, which in my view are objective and are very hard to counter. And there's a very good book by Asa Winstanley on the weaponization of anti-Semitism in the context of the UK, where lies and Israeli subsidies of various kinds were used to destroy the political credibility of Jeremy Corbyn, who had been selected as the head of the Labour Party and was committed to a balanced Israel-Palestine approach. So that this whole struggle for what you referred to as the hearts and minds is very much at the center of Israeli efforts to confuse debate and confuse perceptions in such a way that it can pursue its expansionist ambitions and not have to worry about acting in a lawful and responsible manner.
I've been reading a book of yours, Reflections on the Vietnam War, and in it you have a chapter entitled Vietnam Syndrome. Coming out of the Vietnam War, there was a U.S. right-wing claim that we were stabbed in the back, which is why they said we lost the war. And that stab in the back was by the media mainly. And so they developed strategies for controlling the media, which we saw in the first Gulf War, as I personally saw being there. So we've had our own information warfare, Rand Corporation writing numerous things about it and the need for it, et cetera. Perhaps just you could touch on that a bit and that Vietnam War history and how it's taking place today as U.S. policy.
Yes, there's no question that what you say is part of the adjustment that the militarized establishment tried to make so that war and foreign intervention would again be given a respectable reputation and as a doable undertaking. It was not only the discourse control through the media, through the corporatization of the media, but also the abolition of the draft, the selective service system, which was seen as responsible for generating the anti-war movement because it brought into the context of participating in the war America's middle classes and more educated citizenry, and it was those people and their parents who were at the forefront of the objections to the war, so that the Vietnam syndrome emerged out of this sense that U.S. shouldn't engage in foreign intervention because, first of all, it didn't serve legitimate security interests. Secondly, that it was very costly in terms of lives and investment. And thirdly, because it had this devastating domestic backlash that discredited the governing elites. So these, and fourthly, that it diminished the leadership status of the U.S. that had been acquired after World War II. So it was in the first Gulf War that the adjustments were tested, but they were tested in a way that was didn't resemble the Vietnam War, which was a war fought by an interventionary military force against a mobilized nationalist movement. In Iraq in 1991, Saddam Hussein foolishly tried to make it a war between opposed conventional armies. And of course, that kind of confrontation is easily decided by the side that possesses superior military capabilities. And so when the senior George Bush said after the Iraq War, we finally kicked the Vietnam syndrome in the deserts of Arabia, he made a false claim, because every subsequent conflict of any consequence, including Iraq, the second Iraq War, has ended in political failure for the United States. It invested heavily in the state-building project in Afghanistan and the defeat of the Taliban as the ruling party there. And yet that kind of investment gave way to the nationally superior forces within a week of the American departure. Same thing in Libya, there was chaos caused, but not the political outcome that NATO had sought. And Ukraine doesn't look much better, and the consequences in other countries that have been subjected to this kind of foreign intervention have shown that nationally mobilized peoples can eventually outlast the military dominance of an intervening side. And this nightmare scenario, I think, has been part of Israel's paranoia about Iran, about Hamas, about any kind of mobilized resistance. And therefore it's relevant to the current situation.
Karl von Clausewitz, the author of On War, and usually misconstrued as an ultra-militarist, or sometimes, but he is more correctly understood as a philosopher of war, the study of war. He made the point that war is never an isolated act. War is never an isolated act, meaning that includes all these other stages of aggression. So in the case of Gaza, it's been held that Hamas initiated the war on October 7th, but as we've already discussed, it's military occupation, so that's a form of war itself, already having been waged on Gaza and the Palestinians. And the same with Ukraine. We see that as February 24th, 2022 as the beginning of that war. But in fact, the U.S. was involved in that long before that date with acts of aggression, just like we had been before the Vietnam War against North Vietnam. Perhaps you could give us a little background of that as a way for people to analyze wars a little bit more broadly, and how they actually begin.
Well, I think that it's a very intriguing issue, and Clausewitz is famous for his idea that war is the continuation of politics by other means. And that, I think, is evident in many of these conflicts, that when political methods are not effective in achieving the ambitions, the strategic ambitions, then recourse to war becomes a serious option for the political actor that thinks of itself as in control or having material advantages. And war originates out of the sense that it can be won, and or out of, in some cases, in situations of desperation where a country feels surrounded and economically strangled, as some have said that Japan felt before it attacked the US at Pearl Harbor. So that the origins of war are part of the fog of war, in the sense that there are different motivations in different contexts, but it's always a decision that has unpredictable consequences that may be very detrimental, not only for the society that is the target of the war, but also for the society that initiates the war. And so I felt, for instance, that the Vietnam Syndrome was a very healthy source of prudence for the United States to follow if it really wanted to avoid new disastrous commitments in foreign policy. But it hasn't been willing to give up this role that it acquired after World War II of being what Madeleine Albright called the indispensable nation, what Biden calls the essential nation, that has this global mission of securing peace as defined by Washington all over the world. It's what I've called the Monroe Doctrine for the world, where only the U.S. is entitled to intervene anywhere, whether it's in the South Pacific or along the Russian border, anywhere. If that kind of logic had prevailed during the Cold War, it would have turned into World War III. But the leaders during World War II were smart enough to agree upon some geopolitical fault lines, particularly in Europe, that acknowledged the special interests of Soviet Union in Eastern Europe and the US in Western Europe. And if those fault lines had not been respected, I think that a major war would have broken out. And it was not easy to respect them because both sides did some pretty obstructive things within their spheres of influence. The Soviets intervened forcibly and in a rather violent way in Hungary in 1956 and East Germany in 1958. The West used covert means, the CIA, to destroy the communist parties in Western Europe that had emerged from World War II in a position that could easily have challenged the more bourgeois political parties for political control of their respective states. So it's important to understand that peace between geopolitical actors in the past have depended on the existence and respect for spheres of influence, which after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US had has attempted to suggest belong in the dustbin of history, which is a phrase that the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has used to ignorantly suggest that spheres of influence were rejected after World War II. That's really historically completely wrong. They had their high point in between World War II, the end of World War II, and the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, as I've suggested, and in varying ways, these kinds of mutually agreed political constraints. There's no international law that validates spheres of influence. And in those countries around the world that were divided because of ideological reasons, Korea, Vietnam, and to some degree Germany and Berlin, that's where the wars and violence did occur, because there were no clear geopolitical fault lines of the sort that existed in Europe after World War II.
One final question, and going back, and it sort of follows everything you've already discussed, but Benjamin Netanyahu's father, Ben Zion, so he did an interview shortly before his 100th birthday, which wasn't that long ago, and then he died shortly after that. But he openly called for the ethnic cleansing of what he would consider Greater Israel. Came right out and said it, and as well told the interviewer that his son was in agreement with that. But in the past, I've heard that Greater Israel was always considered to include the, not just from the river to the sea, but both banks of the river, meaning the Jordan River, meaning partly Jordanian territory. Do you see that still evident within the maximalists of now governing Israel, so that the next stage would, as you've already pointed out, include against Jordan?
Yes, Jordan and Lebanon, and I think it's more a theme in this maximalist Zionist vision, and it's a vision that is partly just a matter of political and economic ambition. It's partly also a kind of paranoid security vision that unless Israel can control in a reliable way not only its own borders, but a buffer zone beyond those borders, it will be in jeopardy. And of course, it's fearful of Iran breaking the nuclear monopoly that Israel has been allowed by the West to acquire, which is not often discussed, but is one of the developments, in my view, that has undermined prospects for any kind of political compromise, because it puts Israel in a hegemonic relationship to the rest of the region, particularly if it can maintain its monopoly over nuclear weapons, and reinforced by the U.S. policy commitment to make sure that Israel always has a superior edge in conventional weaponry. And conventional weaponry creeps closer to the capabilities and penetration and toxic properties that are associated with nuclear weapons. So it is not a pretty picture of what the future entails if that future will be shaped by maximalist Zionists or their colleagues, of which Netanyahu is probably the most prominent. And it's in a certain way fortunate that the October 7th Hamas attack has seen a growth in anger toward Netanyahu, partly for the lapse of security and partly for his failure to take any responsibility for that lapse. And so now the Likud party and his leadership seem in jeopardy, although one can't rule out some kind of anti-democratic takeover of the Israeli government and the continuation of that very intense intra-Israeli, Jewish-Israeli conflict over the reform of the judiciary that preceded these current developments that have diverted attention from that conflict.
Even calling fascist in Israel now is receiving a lot of American conservative, so-called conservative support, now calling themselves national conservatives, a movement that originated by an Israeli settler. Any final comments on that, and any final thing you might want to say, and then I will let you go.
Well, I would only say that there is both a tacit alignment and an explicit alignment between fascist tendencies in Europe and North America, and that they are likely to become much more overt should Trump succeed in becoming the American president. It's sort of Steve Bannon's vision of the world, and it includes this kind of Israeli support for the most extreme Israeli vision. And in the background of this kind of fascist rising are the ideas of Samuel Huntington about a clash of civilizations. Because I think that part of what we're witnessing in the Middle East at the present time is and Ukraine in a different way feeds this picture that the West is trying to confront and defeat Islamic power as represented by Hezbollah and by the Houthis in Yemen, and of course by Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhoods in Turkey and Egypt. And it's a new clash of civilization, a new phase of the clash of civilization, and it has an Islamophobic element in it, which is possibly going to generate a new kind of jihadism within the Islamic world as a way of fighting back. And it's a scary set of developments that we should be very wary of, and not feel that traditional democratic constitutionalism will protect societies against this rise of fascism, which is sufficiently unscrupulous as to stage coups against its own government. So we live in a dangerous and possibly very destructive period of human history. No, well, thank you for raising these fundamental questions and giving me the opportunity to reflect upon some of these issues that I've been thinking about in recent weeks and months, years, and feel very depressed about, thinking that it's important that we don't give up hope, that we struggle against these tendencies and don't give in to the temptations of despair and political passivity, because that's what allowed Hitler to rise, the whole Weimar temperament that was unwilling to confront this danger until it was too late. Let's not repeat the mistakes of the Weimar Republic.